the next important thing that we'd want to do is set up our model. We need a module in which to create our model. So we interacted with this dialog a little bit the other day, and by default, we just have the top. We have no modules yet, and we can create both modules and substructures. Since we're making a fairly simple model, we can just build modules directly under the top. But as we saw in some of the sample models, you may want to create a substructure for like the bow, midship, and stern, deck house, different areas. For purposes of our model, we'll just create a new one. We'll call it, we'll put it in the top. So we need to click on top to make that sort of the active part where we're going to create this. And by default, it wants to create a substructure, but we want to create a module. Now this currently is a substructure, and it's not going to let us change the top to be something other than a substructure. So we have to first change the name, and we'll add beam 0 is what we'll call the first section of the beam. And we'll change it to be a module when we create it. Now you can create it now, and actually it's probably best to create it now. So before we change to another tab. In some dialogues, when you change to the next tab, if you haven't clicked modify, you may lose those changes. Sometimes you need to hit modify to commit them before you move on to the next tab. Typically in a single dialogue, most of them, I shouldn't say most, several of them do, but in some of them you can modify before you close the dialogue, but there are, I think, a couple where just changing the tab may clear the changes you've made, so you'd have to hit modify before you switch to the next tab. Our location we're going to leave as the origin. This is the first beam, or the first module in the beam, so we're going to start it at the global origin. And if we're going to be using strakes, we want to create a spacing for and how many sections are going to be in that module. We want to define that, and this will specify what the length of the module is. And by default, when you create a new module, you have 10 sections in it and at a 1 meter spacing. It doesn't have to be a uniform spacing. We could make this, half a meter, 1 meter, 1 meter, 2 meter, half a meter, and so forth, and change them around. Typically, when we're doing ship framing, we'll have an even spacing so that our frames land on some multiple of these sections. Not necessarily each one. We might use a half meter spacing and have frames every 1.5 meters or 2 meters. So for purposes of this little sample beam, what units do you typically work in? You operate in SI, and we will, so it doesn't get too long, we'll make this about a 2.5 meter section. So we'll take these 10 sections that we currently have, and you can highlight them all and respace them, basically assign new spacing values to them. And in order to do that, you would select the first one, scroll down to the bottom, and hold the shift key down and select all of them, and just say respace and assign a new spacing value. And we'll use 1/4 meter, and now they've all been reassigned. If you only had one that you wanted to change, you can change a specific one and respace it to, say, 0.5, but we'll undo that and put it back to 0.25, keep the uniform spacing. If you had too many, you wanted to shorten up the module, you can select a couple and remove them. Similarly, if you wanted additional sections in here, you can add them. If you hit add, it just says, insert how many sections and what spacing do you want. So now we have our beam 0 module set up to use 10 sections, 1/4 meter, so the total length is going to be 2.5 meters. For default values, this specifies sections per bay is for your framing. If you use frames, or if you define frames on your strake, it'll tell you how many sections should be in each frame bay. You don't have to use this. You can manually define them and use that deletions dialog, but it makes it very easy to just sort of automatically space it if we want to have a frame on every other section. So we'll set this to 2, and that will by default give us a frame on every other node along the length of our strake. And we're not using cylindrical coordinates, so we don't have to worry about the cylinder length. Now the reference end frame and opposite end frame are whether or not there should be a frame located at the first node or the last node. Reference end and opposite end basically refer to the start and end of the module. So this sections per bay basically is for all of the internal frames inside the length of that strake. But if you want one on node 0, or in this case, node 10, node 0 would be the reference end, and node 10 would be the opposite end. So we'll go ahead and leave it on the reference end, but we'll leave it cleared on the opposite end. And you probably want to be consistent with this if you are working down the length of the hull. If you had both of them checked, where one module ends and the next module starts, each one of those will have its own frame at that location if you have the opposite end of the first one and the reference end of the next one. So you'll wind up with an overlapped element. So if you have a number of modules in line going down the length of the hull, you probably only want to have your reference or frame at the end of the module, either on the reference end or on the opposite end, so they don't wind up overlapping. And if you're running bulkhead to bulkhead, watertight bulkhead to watertight bulkhead, you wouldn't have the frames at either end, since you wouldn't want them overlapping with the bulkhead plating. And we'll go ahead and modify that. And if we go back into sections, you can see I moved away from that sections tab, and I don't think I hit modify when I did that, but it remembers what my changes were.